Battle of Okinawa was very, very brutal especially for the civilians in Okinawa. And that was partly because of the nature of the U.S. assault on the island. The U.S. began back in October of 1944 with the bombing of Okinawa, and then the invasion began in the spring. And so, the civilians some of them were actively supporting the Japanese forces and involved with the fighting. The students in junior high school were forced to support the Japanese military effort, as were many of the civilians in Okinawa. But the fighting was very, very bloody and very brutal. And the American bombing tended to be indiscriminate. And that was the case against Japan overall. When the U.S. bombing campaign begins the night of March 9th and March 10th in Tokyo, the strategy is to use incendiary bombs to burn down the Japanese cities, to create firestorms. So the Americans, who had been careful in most of the European war not to target civilians, did not have any compunction about targeting civilians in Japan. In fact, that was the strategy. So the citizens of Okinawa were dealing with several different forces who had very little regard for their safety and well-being. The Americans were certainly not did not take steps to protect the civilians. And the Japanese soldiers were in some ways even worse. And the Japanese, the resources were scarce, space was scarce, and the stories that I've heard in my visits to Okinawa have been truly horrific. Stories about Japanese soldiers forcing mass suicides upon the people of Okinawa, telling them stories about how brutally they were going to be treated by the Americans. They were going to be raped and murdered, and therefore they should commit suicide when they had the chance. And in many cases, when the Japanese soldiers were trying to hide out in the caves in Okinawa, they threw out the Okinawan civilians who were hiding in those caves. And those stories are also terrible. So without any shelter, without any protection, the Okinawan civilians were killed in great numbers, and including women, including children. And it was just a very, very brutal, horrible experience. And the people of Okinawa resented the Japanese troops, in some cases even more than they resented the American invaders. But the Okinawans were not treated well by anybody. Nobody was looking out for their best interests. And the Japanese troops' behavior was really reprehensible. And in many ways, their behavior was so selfish that they caused the deaths, unnecessary deaths, of thousands and thousands of Okinawan civilians.